Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tevach, a good week. We continue the journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is the merit and schus and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg, Olav Shalom, and Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz, Olav Shalom. It's also in the merit of Rab Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz. May they have many healthy, long years. In the last year, in the last class, we studied and learned the Hagah, the gloss of the Alter Rebbe in the second chapter of Tanya. Let's put it in context. We're going to conclude that gloss in Mitzvah Hashem today and continue on in understanding the very nature of a neshama, of a soul. So in this chapter 2, the Alter Rebbe introduced the Nefesh Hashenis, the second soul, B'Yisrael, in a Jew, as a chilik elekam imal mamash, as a divine force, a piece of the divine that manifests a divine personality, and this neshama will descend throughout the whole Ishtalshelus, the entire cosmic order, until it comes into this world upon the conception and birth of a child. And this neshama will carry that revealed divine state. In contrast to the animal soul, the Nefesh Habamis, discussed at the end of chapter 1, that is worldly, so to speak, being that it comes from Klippas Nega, the divine energy as it is encased in a husk, in a shell, in a peel. So what has the power? What gives the human being the power to transform the world and turn it into a home for God through Torah and mitzvahs? Is the Nefesh Elikis, is the second Shama. And the Alter Rebbe explained, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim, the soul has the very inner revelation of divine energy, God blowing like breath, but a strong intensity. It's like a child from Moyach Ha'av, a child that comes from the very DNA and very genetic material and essence of the parent, of the father. And Machshavta Yisbarach, it comes from God's thought and mind, which is connected, is a moshel, of course, like the mind that expresses and is the closest expression of the very soul, the very essence of the soul. And being that Hu v'chachma seyachad, that God is one with His chachma, which is different. Chakim v'lei b'chachmi yediyah. God's chachma is different than ours, being that He's one with it. So though now we're talking about the level of the neshama as it's coming from moichin, from chachma, machshavti she'yizbarach, like a child that comes from the moyach ha'av, but it's united with the essence of the Eibishter. And he brings the Rambam, hu hamada hu yedeya. Now we can't understand, he says, but nevertheless, that's what it is. So with a human being, as much as a child comes from the moyach, from the mind of the father, there's still two, the mind and the father are not one entity. They're close, and it's the deepest connections between the mind and the thought of the father and his being and his soul. But with the Eibishter, it's much higher than that. They're actually one. But this, of course, opens up a Pandora's box of the dilemma: how do we reconcile? How do we bridge these two realities? We know the Eibishter is higher than all structure, as the Maral disagrees with the Rambam. Hu amadu yedeya, but the Eibishter is beyond any type of level of yediyah, any definition, any faculty, even the highest faculties. And yet we're saying it's one. So the Alter Rebbe addresses this in the Haggadah that we are middle of learning. The first thing he says, that this is the Rambam's approach, that's what it says inside the Tanya. So that's the basic answer, that there is something in common and some unity between God and Chachmoseh, or Mada v'Yideya, basically in his mind. God's mind and God are one. But we have to deal with the issue that, especially the Mukabalim address, and that is God tachlis hapshitas. Poshet b'tachlis hapshitas. It's completely seamlessness and shape. So the first thing the Alter Rebbe brings in the Haggadah is the Ramak. That heidiloi chachmei HaKabbalah, k'meshikosu b'pardes ma'Ramak. That they agree with the Rambam that the spheres, in the language of Kabbalah, are one with the source. Like we say, Iyu v'chayu ichad, Iyu v'garmu ichad. You, God, are one with your eiris, with your energies, and one with your containers. Obviously, the Maral's opinion still stands strong, but we have a level, not defined yet in specific details, where Das and Chochmah are connected with the Eibishter. But we know that's not the etzem of the Eibishter. And that's where he comes now the next section in the Haggadah. What about the Arizal? It says, V'gam lefi Kabbalas Arizal. And even according to the Kabbalah, the Lurianic Kabbalah, where the Arizal understands the Ein Arech, the distance of Elokus, of godliness, from the structure of existence far deeper than the Mukabalim before him, including the Ramak. Because the Ramak, at the end of the day, he's saying that there is something in common, not God forbid with the creations, but with the divine faculties have something in common with the divine. In the language of the Ramak, that even though Keser, which is the first emanation, the desire of God, is more distant from the source, which is God himself, than Asiya is from Keser, but still, Keser is somewhat closer. Because remember, as we discussed, the Ramak is not seeing this from the context of Tzimtzum. Lo Yodami not Tzimtzum. So the issue of God's complete infinite distance is not being addressed. He's speaking about the godliness, even the godliness that's above structure, but still, the process is a ilah v'olol one, cause and effect, and the Eibishter is the highest cause, and he's not addressing the part of God, so-called the Godhead, the essence of the divine that's beyond it all. So therefore, like the Rambam, there's something in common between Hu and Chachmoseh. And that's why you could say that Hu v'Chachmoseh echad. But the Arizal, who introduces the Chiddush of the Seidat Tzimtzum, and the Seidat Tzimtzum is what? Is teaching us that God is completely beyond. And there's nothing in common. That Keser and Asiya are equally distant, completely equal. Not that one is more distant than the other. Completely equal. And the Tzimtzum explains how. The Tzimtzum, essentially, you have to conceal the entire infinite divine, because if it was there, lo yoyin esinis mokem le'elam is klal, in the language of the Arizal, in the beginning of Eitz Chaim. So we need to have a situation where we need a Tzimtzum that completely conceals the divine essence of the light. Eir Ein Sof. And then, after the Tzimtzum, comes the Kav, that stream of light and consciousness. Now that we've created space for an independent consciousness, now comes a stream of light of the divine consciousness into this Chol Mokim Ponei, and begins the process of all of existence. So therefore, the concept of spheres are only after the Tzimtzum. Says the Alter Rebbe. So according to this, you could say, you know what, the Hu v'Chachmoseh echad is only after the Tzimtzum. So in a way, going back to Chelik Elikam and Mal Mamish, the Neshama, we said, comes from the very essence of the divine, like a child from the essence of the Father, from the mind of God, and that mind is one with the deepest levels. Now that there's a tzimtzum, so Chachmasa is Taka united with the divine, but only after the tzimtzum. So you can basically say that the neshama comes from Chachma, but not from the highest levels that are before the tzimtzum. Says the Alter Rebbe like this, that Gam lefi Kabbalah Zrizal Zuchrein Levrachi Yetziva Milsa. This idea also can be understood and reconciled. How? B'seid islapshus erein sov baruch hu alidei tzimtzumim rabim b'kelim the Chachma Bina V'das. Because the Arizal with a tzimtzum is not coming actually to make God more distant. It's actually to have a relationship with the Eibishter. But you have to also deal with the godliness that's beyond existence. Well, according to the Ramak, there's something in common between the divine and the structure that the divine creates, the attributes which are the spheres. That is, I was saying that Tzimtzum deals with the fact that the Eibishter is completely Shalei Berach. But that same Elikus, after the Tzimtzum, it says the Slapshus Erein Sov Baruch Hu, through the Tzimtzumim Rabim, translating, through the secret doctrine of how the infinite light of godliness underwent multiple diminishments to the point that it could enter finite vessels, the Tzimtzumim Ram B'Kelim of Chochma Bina Das, of Chochma Bina and Das, which is already structured, the beginning of Meichin, including, of course, starting with Chochma. Remember, Chochma is the operative word here. So here you can understand it because basically we're talking about Chochma Bina V'Das, the Atzilus, of Atzilus. So there, in that context, through the Tzimtzumim, which includes the Tzimtzum Arishan, and all the other diminishments, now you have a divine structure of Eris and Kelim in Atzilus. But to understand this well, we need to have to discuss Atzilus. Because seemingly right now, we have a contradiction here, a paradox. On one hand, we just introduced God's Ein Arech, which means before the Tzimtzum, you can't talk about Hu v'Chachmosecha because there's no Chachma. Where could you discuss it only after the Tzimtzum? So that would seem to suggest that the neshamas that originate from Chachma are not Chelek Elikam Mamash, they come from Chachma, which comes after the Tzimtzum. So there's some type of diminishment of the divine, concealment of the divine. On the other hand, he's saying it's reconcilable with the whole principle that we're discussing here. So let's discuss Atzilus for a moment. Chassidus explains that Atzilus is the interface between the divine and existence. What does that mean? The Eibishter could have created anything any way he wanted. He didn't need anything. Kol Yachol, Breshis Bar Elikim, here's a world. But he wanted that this world and the people in this world and the neshamas that come in this world should be able to have a relationship with him. First of all, to understand, according to the logic and reasoning, that God himself created. So he didn't just do a Kol Yachol thing. He did it with a structure, divine reason, so we can understand it, and secondly, so we can retrace the steps and connect. The question is, what high level can you connect to? And the answer is, to the highest of the highest. But you need to have an interface. Where do these two meet? So Atzilus is a combination of two opposites. On one hand, it's called Odom Elyon. It's a structure. When we say that the human being was created b'tzalmenu kidmusenu, b'tzelem elikim, we know God has no tzelem. What tzelem elikim? What image? And the answer is, it's the way the divine, Elikus, manifested in a structure. And what is the structure? Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Yesod, Malchus. The 10 spheres. That's the structure. So on one hand, it has structure, but it's a divine structure. It's basically Elikus choosing to manifest in a form of structure. The truth is, the Eibishter is beyond structure. And that's the second part of Atzilus. That Atzilus is Elikus. That the structure of Atzilus, as opposed to the structure of Bri, Yitzir, Asiyah, is not a defined structure in the sense as we understand structure with real parameters. It's godliness choosing to express in this fashion. One of the Moshalim that Tzemach Tzaddik gives for it, it's like the Melech wants to give gives one gift to one person with his right hand, another with his left hand. It's the same king. He's just expressing it in different forms. The Ramak has an example of the Eidos and Kelim being like shapeless energies in colored glass. So the light, and the energy, the water, which is colorless, doesn't have a color, but it looks like it has a color when you put it into a red glass or a blue glass. So here you have both opposites. On one hand, you have some structure, but it's still a divine structure. Chakim v'lei b'chachmi yediyah. There's chachma, but it's not the chachma we know. On the other hand, to say there's no chachma, it's the root of chachma. So when we learn Torah, kol ha'kedah v'sheinu, Kodesh Baruch Hu yeshiv v'sheinu kenegdei, kol ha'yeshiv v'kedah v'sheinu. Someone who sits and learns Torah, Kodesh Baruch Hu yeshiv v'kedah v'sheinu kenegdei, means we are bonding with God's mind. But God is beyond the mind. But God chose to manifest in a mind. In this case, chachmase, which is the root of the neshama. Later we'll learn about its connection to Torah as chachmase shel Kodesh Baruch Hu. So on one hand it's alakus, on the other hand it's alakus with a handle that you can hold on to. And the Mukabalim discuss this at length, different opinions exactly how it works. But we're talking now according to that Izal, and according to that Izal, the Lifnei Tzimtzum that is take the pure alakus that doesn't have structure yet. In truth is, Chassidus talks about the 10 hidden spheres that originate before the Tzimtzum. It's not a structure, but it's God envisioning structure, called the 10 hidden spheres. Just to round out the topic. But after the Tzimtzum, it's not just, okay, now we move to a new paradigm. After the Tzimtzum, the alakus now manifests as, like he says, b'slapsus. B'sei the slapsus, Ein Sof, Baruch Hu, Yidei Tzimtzumim Rabim, b'kelim, the Chochmah Bina V'das, the Atzilus. And there, it's united, it's divine attributes. So when we say, Mahu Chanun, Afata Chanun, just as he is kind, you should be kind. Mahu Rachum, Afata Rachum, just as he is compassionate, you should be compassionate. That's where we meet. Because the world of compassion, we can relate to. There's human compassion. Human compassion evolves from divine compassion. But divine compassion, on one hand, is compassion, so it has something in common with us. On the other hand, it's divine. Is the Eibishter choosing to manifest in a compassionate way? So there we have the interface. A true interface, a true emtsoi, has to have like a translator. If someone knows only Hebrew or English, they're not a translator. They have to know Hebrew and English. They have to speak the language of both parties. Atzilus speaks the language of the divine, but a language, Dibra Teira B'Loshen B'nei Adam, a language that you and I can identify with and connect with. We have something to hold on to. And that's where the partnership happens. Now, of course, the goal is to ultimately reach higher than Atzilus, which we'll talk about in a moment. But now you have, according to the Arizal, Yitziva Milsa, this idea is there. In other words, the Rambam's opinion, Hu Madu Yedeya, which Haidule Chach B'Kabbalah, the Ramak, has, according to the Arizal also, it's an Atzilus after all the Tzimtzumim. And it's interesting, the Alter Rebbe uses B'Seidis Lapsus. We talk about Seidat Tzimtzum. Seidis Lapsus Ein Sof. It's a form of a secret because it's something at the end of the day, it's only a divine power to be able to do this. So it's a mysterious element, but it makes sense. This itself is an example of a concept we can talk about, and yet it somewhat remains beyond us, like he says in the Prim of Tanya, that even though Madu Hu Yedeya, a person cannot fully, completely understand it. So why are you telling it to us? But that gufa is something that we can somewhat grasp and comprehend. And that also is part of the process of connecting with Elokus. So there's connecting to Elokus by understanding God in a very direct way, but there's also understanding the mystery and that which is beyond us, which in turn manifests in Atzilus, in Chachma Bina V'das. So now we have that Hu V'Chachmase Echad. According to the Arizal, you have both elements. You have it in Atzilus, and that Atzilus is united with the way it is, the higher levels of Elokus, because the Eibishter is ultimately, his Keich HaGvul, his Er HaGvul, is also an extension of Elokus. It's not the full expression of the divine Ein Sof, and even beyond Ein Sof. but it's an expression. It's a divine expression. In other words, Chochmah is not just a bria, a creation, it's a netzal, it's an emanation. And as such, it is connected with the source in Atzilus. But then he continues now. Ach loy l'mayla ma'atzilus. This unity that we're describing, and it's a fundamental unity. It means that the Chochmah Bina V'das that emanates from God is connected with God. However, that's the role of Atzilus. That's within Atzilus, but not higher than Atzilus. So what the Rambam says, Hu Amada V'Yehudeya, and what the Ramak Heideloi agrees with that is correct in Atzilus, but not correct above Atzilus. Which means above the state where you don't yet have these definitions of structure. So Tzelem Elikim, yes, in Atzilus, but there's a level and higher levels that are beyond and transcend structure. So Achlei L'mayla Ma'atzilus. So what does that mean? Let's discuss that. That does not mean we don't connect to levels that are higher than Atzilus. It means this statement, that structure of Chochmah Bina Das, Hu Amada Hu Yedeya, Chochmah Shel Kodesh Baruch Hu, Hu Chochmah Echad, Chad is essentially, in Atzilus, that's where the meeting takes place. If you want to go higher than Atzilus, you have to be able to appreciate that this Chochmah is really bottled and completely nullified to the levels that are higher than that, as we'll read now, the end of the Haggadah. And this is what the Alter Rebbe writes. As it's explained elsewhere, it's explained elsewhere, Shayachid V'Amuna, the second section of Tanya, chapter 9. She'ein Seif Baruch Hu, Mereimom u'misnase, Reimus ein ketz. Lamayla mayla memuchus ubchinas, Chochmah ubina v'das. The blessed infinite light, Ein Seif Baruch Hu, is incomparably higher and more exalted than the energies of Chochmah, Bina, and Das, which are in the world of Atzilus. So this, of course, is a fundamental principle, especially taught in Kabbalah, explained in Chassidus, that the Eibishter is beyond. According to the Rambam, you could say, and the Ramak, in that context, you can say, our primary relationship with the Eibishter is the Eibishter as he relates to our structure. Or say our structure, to the structure that the Eibishter created, where we can meet him. And they don't really talk about levels higher than that. We'll talk about the Ramak in a moment, because there's two ways to learn Pshat here in this Haggadah. Okay, the Arizal, on the other hand, introduces, what do you mean? There's a whole part of Elikuz that's beyond us. So you could either say it's off limits, or you could say no, we want to address it, we need to acknowledge it. In the sense that Tzimtzum acknowledges it, because the Tzimtzum conceals that whole dimension, so that existence can emerge. But that is not meant to separate us. It's actually meant to connect us, like it's known when you say Havdalah. So Havdalah, everyone says a separation. Mavdal ben Kedesh L'chel, between holy and the profane. Between Sheish Yimei Mai Shabbos and Sheish Yimei Maaseh. The 6 days of creation and Yom HaShvi, the 7th day. But Havdalah, by recognizing that there's a separation between Kedesh Kadoshim and Kedesh, and between Kedesh and other levels, that actually unites them both. Because it's respecting and identifying in a true way that we're different. And as we know that we're different, that makes us one. If you try to eliminate the Havdalah, that's the problem. If you try to see Shabbos and Chayil as equal, that's not realistic. That's not true. But by appreciating their distinction, you actually make them connected. By appreciating the Ein Harech of Elikus, you connect with it. Because now you respect it in that way. And as such, the connection is there. However, it's not a connection purely on our terms, meaning the structure of Chochmah Bina Das, because the Eibishter Reimamus, like you just said, is Ein Ketz, L'mayla mayla muhus b'chinas Chochmah Bina Das. And there's the paradox. While Elokus unites with Chachma Bina Das and Atzilus, higher than Atzilus, it's higher than Chachma Bina Das. But as we explain it deeper in Chassidus, it actually says that through your connecting in Atzilus, Chachma Bina V'das to Elokus, to godliness, that helps you also ultimately connect it also to the godliness that's beyond the structure. The Alter Rebbe does not say that explicitly here. But it also comes to help and understand that the neshama that's a chelik elikam mimal mamish, which there he didn't qualify it. There's no definition. Chelik elikam mimal mamish. But then he said, it travels through chokhmah. Nimsheches, through chokhmah yizbarach. He doesn't say nisave. Nimshecha memachshavte v'chokhmah yizbarach. In other words, it's because the neshama has to take on some structure in order to come into this world. It can't remain beyond structure. So it's drawing the beyond structure of Elokus into the structure of Chachma, which is the neshama in Atzilus, recognizing at the same time that higher than Atzilus is higher than that Machshava and Chachma. And that sense, that itself creates a connection between them. What's the connection? Not that Chaz v'Shalom, that the higher level becomes structure, is the structure is a keli for it. It's bittul to that. And here's the interesting thing. The Alter Rebbe said the Lashon, Kelim, before he said the Lashon, Kelim, Tzimtzum b'Kelim de Chabad Atzilus. What's the Kelim? The Kelim is the structure. Oiris is the energy. Think of Kelim as being like the letters on a page, the words on a page, and the message they're conveying, the idea is the Oiris. So the Oiris of Atzilus, are Davok, are connected to the Eir Ein Sof. They reflect God's intentions, what he wants with Chachma. Keli is the definition and structure. Like we said, Atzilus is a mamutza, an interface, so it has both elements. Structure, while it also has beyond structure. The Eir is somewhat of beyond structure, relative to the containers. And now he's saying that the Eibush is higher b'chlal than the whole Muhusu B'china. Muhusu B'china is Chachma Bina Das. Not just the Keli, not just the Eir, but not just Eir, even the Eir has some form of structure that fits into the Keli. The Eibush is higher than all of that. But then chooses to manifest. So in Atzilus you have, besides the Keli being a Keli to the Eir, the Keli itself is a divine structure. So this we'll learn in more depth in next coming class as we continue on this journey in Tanya. Please go to Tanya Applied, where you can watch or listen to previous episodes as well as ask any questions. Everyone have a good tevach.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.